Hi everyone, and welcome to Week 7 practice exercises. In the video today, we will create an estimated income statement, calculate expected contribution margin ratio, determine break-even sales in units and in dollars, identify the expected margin of safety in dollars, and calculate operating leverage. So let's get started. In this problem set, we're working with Woolsey Industries. So Woolsey Industries expects to maintain the same inventories at the end of the year as at the beginning of the year. The total of all production costs for the year is therefore assumed to be equal to the cost of goods sold. With this in mind, the various department heads were asked to submit estimates of the costs for their departments during the year. And we see that summary right here. We have production cost, selling expenses, and administrative expenses. We have two columns. One is our estimated fixed cost, and the other is our estimated variable cost per unit sold. When we get to factory overhead, we see that we have both fixed cost and estimated variable cost per unit sold. What this means is that even if I produced no units whatsoever, I would still have to pay $200,000 in estimated fixed cost. We'll see how we use both of these numbers as we get into the income statement below. We have a final piece of information. And what this tells us is that it's expected that we're going to sell 21,875 units, and we're going to sell it at a price of $160 per unit. So let's go ahead and dive into the estimated income statement for the year. I went ahead and took the information in this row, and I just put it here in my spreadsheet because I know I'm going to have to reference this information a little later. So this is my income statement. I know that I always start with sales. So this is my sales, and I got this number simply by multiplying my expected units times my sales price. That gave me $3.5 million. For my direct materials, I took the expected units and I multiplied it by the direct materials variable cost per unit. For direct labor, I did the same thing. And then we get to our factory overhead. And this is where we really need to combine both the fixed piece and the variable cost per unit sold. So I took my $200,000 that I have to pay even if I don't produce and sell even one unit. And then I want to add that to the variable costs associated with my factory overhead. So again, I take my expected units that I'm going to sell and the variable cost per unit. And that gives me $637,500. Now, my total cost of goods sold is just the summation of these three items. I made this a negative because it is a cost. And so now my gross profit is just the difference between my sales and these costs. All right. Now we're going to move on to expenses, and we're going to really do the same thing. Our salaries, our sales salaries and commissions. Again, I have a fixed piece for this, and I also have my variable cost per unit sold. I'll do the same thing for advertising, but for advertising, it's going to be a little bit different. I don't have a variable cost. It's just advertising. Same thing for travel. And then my miscellaneous selling expenses, again, I have $1 for my variable cost, and I just want to multiply that by my expected units. So then we have our total selling expenses. And again, that's just the summation of those two. Same thing for administrative expenses. We have no variable cost for office and officer salary, but we do have variable costs for our supplies and our miscellaneous administrative expenses. And now I have my total administrative expenses here, and I've summed it up. And now my total expenses will be both the selling expenses and the administrative expenses together. And I express that as a negative because it is an expense. And so my operating income is going to be my gross profit minus my total expenses. And so that is the estimated income statement for Woolsey Industries. All right, we've done one. Now we're going to move on to the next, which is the expected contribution margin. So the contribution margin ratio, we sometimes call this the profit volume ratio. It's going to be expressed as a percent, and it tells you the percentage of sales available to cover your fixed cost and also provide operating income. So if the contribution margin is 25%, or maybe it's 40%, then that means for every dollar that the company generates, if it's 25%, then 25 cents of that dollar is available to cover fixed cost. If your contribution margin ratio is 40%, then for every dollar that the company generates in sales, then you have 40 cents available to cover those fixed costs. Many businesses are going to use this ratio when they're calculating the impact of accepting a special order, or whether they want to discontinue a product or service. All right, so let's go ahead and calculate the expected contribution margin ratio. So our formula for this is just to take our sales and subtract our variable costs, and that gives us this interim calculation of contribution margin. So I went ahead and pulled down sales, and I pulled down the variable costs. And let's see where I got those variable costs from. I took the variable costs at the bottom of this column, and remember, this is the estimated variable cost per unit sold, and I multiplied that by our expected units. That gave me a variable cost of $2.6 million, and that means that my contribution margin is $875. Now I'm going to take my contribution margin and I'm going to divide it by my sales to get the contribution margin ratio. So I took my contribution margin and I divided it by the sales. This tells me that for every dollar that I generate in sales, 25% of it goes to paying my fixed expenses, or 25 cents goes to generating operating income. Okay, so now let's go on to the next one, which is determining the break-even sales in units and in dollars. So the break-even point is this level where revenues and expenses equal each other. So it's really important to be able to calculate this, because being able to not only calculate but monitor your break-even enables a business to run these things called what-if drills, or some people call them continuity of operation analysis. And they do these things to manage risk, but they also want to make sure that while they're trying to manage risk, they're remaining as profitable as possible. So I mentioned what-if drills and continuity of operations. Continuity of operations, sometimes people call it COOP, and it's COOP, and that's continuity of operations. And I think I got my O's backwards. Hold on, let me try that again. C, little o, big O, P. There we go. So continuity of operations is, again, it's a risk management analysis. This is where businesses can establish plans for operating maybe without electricity or while under a state of emergency. And these are the plans that companies roll out at a moment's notice, depending on what the environment is. All right, so we are going to calculate break even in sales and in dollars. So I have these broken up into two. This is the units. So we're going to calculate break even sales in units first. And we do that by taking our fixed costs and dividing it by our unit contribution margin. So our fixed costs, we saw this up here. These are our fixed costs, $525,000. You can see that estimated fixed cost. So we take our estimated fixed cost and we divide it by our unit contribution margin. How did we get that? Well, we took our contribution margin and we divided it by our expected units that we're going to sell. There are other ways that you can get there, but this is one of the ways. So my unit contribution margin is $40. So out of the $160 that I sell it for, $40 is my unit contribution margin. And now all I'm going to do to find my break even is I'm going to take my fixed cost and divide it by my unit contribution margin. This tells me that I have to produce at least 13,125 units just to break even. If I want to turn a profit, I have to create, or I have to produce more than this unit. Okay, so now we have our break even in units. Now we're going to calculate the break even in dollars. So again, we're still going to start with the fixed cost, but then we're going to divide it by our contribution margin ratio, which we just calculated. So our fixed cost, we've seen this before, that came from above, right here. And our contribution margin ratio, we calculated from over here. So I just pulled that down. Now we're going to calculate this by, again, taking our fixed cost and dividing it by our contribution margin ratio. And this tells me that, again, I have to produce, or I have to make $2.1 million just to break even. If I want to turn a profit, I have to generate more than this. Okay, now we're moving on to our expected margin of safety. So we're going to calculate the expected margin of safety in dollars and as a percentage of sales. And so we do that here, and then our percentage of sales is here. But let's take a moment to talk about what margin of safety is. So we just talked about how continuity of operations is a risk management analysis, right? Well, margin of safety is also a measure of risk, and we express it as this percentage that you see here. So businesses use this to measure the percent of decrease in sales that the business can absorb before they begin realizing an operating loss. Businesses that have lower margins of safety are impacted by even small shocks to the economic environment. So let's go ahead and calculate our expected margin of safety. We want to take our sales and we want to subtract out the sales at break even, and we calculated that just a few moments ago. Then we want to divide that by our sales, and that's going to give us our margin of safety. So we start here. We've seen this before. Sales is $3.5 million. We just calculated our break even in dollars. We can see that came from up here. And now we want to calculate our margin of safety. And so how did we do that? We just subtracted break-even sales from sales. That gave us that interim calculation. And now we're going to calculate the percentage. And how did we do that? We simply took our margin of safety and we divided it by the sales. So this tells us that our margin of safety is 40%. Now for the last calculation, we're going to determine the operating leverage. But again, before we get into the calculation, let's talk about why we even calculate operating leverage. So first of all, operating leverage is the relationship between the company's contribution margin and the operating income. So companies with high fixed costs normally have high operating leverage. And businesses can use the margin of safety to quickly estimate the impact of an increase or decrease in sales. So a business would want to know how a special order that increases sales by 10% is going to impact the operating income. If our operating leverage is 2.5, then the business can, multiply that increase in sales to determine what, how it's going to impact the operating income. So let's just pretend that we have a special order that will increase, it'll increase the sales by 10%, and I have my 10% right here, and we know that our operating leverage is 2.5. I want to know how much is it going to increase my operating income. So I can simply take my 10% and multiply it by my 2.5, and I can estimate very quickly that that special order that I'm going to take on will increase my operating income by 25%. And so that's how we use operating leverage and why it's important to know what your operating leverage is. But first, let's go ahead and let's calculate what our operating leverage is. So operating leverage is determined by taking your contribution margin and dividing it by your operating income. So my contribution margin, where did I get that from? Well, it's up here, $875. And my operating income, where did I get that? Well, I calculated that when we prepared our estimated income statement, and this was my operating income. Now all I'm going to do is take my contribution margin and divide it by my operating income, and I see that I have an operating leverage of 2.5. All right. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope that this helps. I'll see you in the next video.